like that woman foreigner's getting to you. First thing you know, you'll be telling me that there really are, what did she call them?
Vampires.
Ah, yeah, vampires.
Welcome to episode 44 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of the homestead, with two films about isolation, insanity, and rural horror. First up we have The Wind from 2018, a horror-western hybrid from director Emma Tammi, starring Caitlin Gerard, Ashley Zukerman, Julia Goldani-Tellez, and Miles Anderson. Then we follow this with The Dark and the Wicked from director Bryan Bertino. This stars Marin, Michael Abbott Jr., Lynn Andrews, and Xander Berkeley. Along the way, we'll be discussing the history of the horror-western hybrid movie, the condition known as prairie madness, the career of director Bryan Bertino, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Western horror movies and The Wind, I have referred to the books The Geography of Horror, Spaces, Hauntings, and the American Imagination by Marco Lukic, The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, Backwoods Horror and Terror in the Wilderness by Bernice M. Murphy, Desert Horror Movies and Horror Westerns by John LeMay, and West of Everything, The Inner Life of Westerns by Jane Tompkins. I've also referred to interviews with the director, cast and crew, which can be found on the websites cherrypicks.com, filmthreat.com, ruemorgue.com, movablefeast.com, latinhorror.com, and insessionfilm.com. And when discussing Bryan Bertino and The Dark and the Wicked, I have referenced interviews and articles from the websites DallasObserver.com, GoneWithTheTwins.com, DreadCentral.com, RueMorgue.com, WMagazine.com, and TheHollywoodReporter.com. And as usual for both movies, I have also referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb entries for the directors, writers, cast, and crew. Our first film this week, The Wind, belongs to the relatively small subgenre of the horror western. Officially speaking, the film that started this hybrid genre was Curse of the Undead, released in 1959. This features a vampire gunslinger terrorizing an isolated village in the Old West, and originally began life as a joke between writer-director Edward Dean and his wife and co-writer Mildred. That was at least until Universal Studios, sensing a profitable merger of two very popular film genres, decided to take the joke seriously. The Western movie has declined in popularity since the 1970s, and while individual films have cropped up here and there, the glory days of the genre seem to be far behind us. As a result, it can be quite hard for a modern audience to fully appreciate just how dominant it once was. Not just for a season, but for decades. In her book, West of Everything, The Inner Life of the Western, writer Jane Tompkins highlights that from roughly 1900 to 1975, a significant proportion of the US adolescent male population spent every Saturday afternoon at the movies, and what they generally saw there were westerns. As well as cinema, by the 1930s and the 1940s, westerns dominated the so-called golden age of radio, before moving across to television in the 1950s. By 1959, there were no fewer than 35 westerns running concurrently on US television, and the comic book market, seeking to capitalise on the boom, released multiple action-packed and often incredibly formulaic stories of the Wild West. The popularity of the genre can be partially attributed to nostalgia, a longing for an era that one did not experience, and indeed one that might never have existed at all. For a society lurching between two world wars, followed by the creeping horror of the Cold War, the so-called Big Sky country of the Western offered a sense of escape. A simpler time where the bad guys all wore black and the good guys always won out in the end. In her book, Tompkins writes that in this context, the West, quote, functions as a symbol of freedom and of the opportunity for conquest. It seemed to offer escape from the conditions of life in modern industrial society, from mechanized existence, economic dead ends, social entanglements, unhappy personal relations, and political injustice. The desire to change places also signifies a powerful need for self-transformation. The desert light in the desert space, the creak of the saddle leather, and the sun beating down, these things promise the translation of the self into something pure and morally authentic, more intense and more real. End quote. Given the popularity of the Western, it made perfect sense for studios like Universal to consider merging it with the other popular genre of horror, attempting to capture both markets and effectively double their money. It was a logical strategy, but one that didn't really pay off, though this may have had more to do with the quality of the offerings than anything in the actual concept itself. As mentioned, Curse of the Undead, which was released in the US as the bottom half of a double bill with Hammer's The Mummy, started off rather inauspiciously. Edward Dean, who had co-written the screenplay for the 1943 Val Lewton movie The Leopard Man, and his wife Mildred initially wrote the screenplay as writing practice, trying to come up with the most outrageous story that they could imagine. The end result was a screenplay titled Eat Me Gently, a Western horror story about a gay vampire roaming the Great Plains and preying on available young cowboys. Written in just 2 weeks, they passed it round their friends as a joke, until one day it found its way onto the desk of Joseph Gershenson, one of the producers of Universal's 1945 horror House of Dracula. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the period, Gershenson didn't really care much for either the comedic or the explicitly queer elements, but he did recognise the potential in a horror-western hybrid. He changed the title to the not much better Affairs of a Vampire and asked Dean to do some rewrites and also direct. Shot over 18 days and made on a very low budget, the film is actually a lot better than you might expect. The idea of a vampire gunslinger who never loses a shootout because he's impervious to bullets is certainly original, and Dean also incorporates elements of the vampire myth from Eastern Europe. His vampires do not spread vampirism through their bite, are not killed by sunlight, which is quite handy given the desert location, and also do not turn into bats. And this last point is something that Dean highlighted in the film's press book, saying, quote, "Recent research into early vampire legends has shown that the bat-like flying apparition craze was the product of the inventive mind of Hollywood." End quote. The vampire, played by Michael Pate, is also a sympathetic character, reborn as a vampire after his own suicide, which once again harkens back to the legends of Eastern Europe. At one point he shouts out at the hero, "What I am is not my own choice. You should pity me and not judge me in my torment. Do you think I wanted this?" It's also very well shot, incorporating nods to the output of Hammer films, and with heavy black and white stylization, something that actor Michael Pate commented on later, saying, quote, "It was stylized, it had a good set design, very good lighting, and it was photographed well." End quote. But although the film was successful, this is most likely due to its screening alongside a Hammer movie than it is to any real demand for such content on the part of the audience. And although it can be seen as the first of the horror western subgenre, it's fair to say that there was hardly a boom in production of such films as a result. In 1965, another low-budget effort called The Devil's Mistress was produced by the New Mexico State University Film Department and was originally filmed under the title La Bruja, or The Witch. And very big spoiler warning for this one now, as I am about to run through the entire plot. This film tells the story of a husband and wife who have, importantly, been expelled from Salem for their religious beliefs and are attacked by a group of outlaw cowboys. The husband is murdered, and the wife, called Leah, is assaulted and held captive. But as the group continue on their journey, the captors are all killed one by one, either seemingly drained of their life energy or as a result of bizarre accidents, including a rattlesnake attack and an accidental hanging. Eventually, all of the men are killed, leaving Leah to await the return of her husband, who reveals himself at the end to not be dead at all. As well as being a horror western, this film can also be said to be an early entry in another horror subgenre, the often problematic rape revenge movie, and this would include later films like 1978's I Spit on Your Grave. It was also one of the first American regional independent films to receive distribution through Hollywood. Fairly well reviewed at the time, it was screened across 4,000 US theatres in 1966, after which it seemed to disappear without a trace, until a print was discovered in 2018, following the death of its director, Orville Wanzer. It's available to watch on YouTube, but it is very low budget, and the quality of the print is incredibly poor. That being said though, the storyline has some very interesting ideas for the time, particularly its depiction of cowboys as villains, and the blending of the legend of the Salem witches with the Wild West. Far less serious in its ambitions, but probably better known, is the film Billy the Kid vs. Dracula, which was also released in 1966. This is, being blunt, an absolutely appalling film, and was described by writer John LeMay as being, quote, so outlandishly inept that it seems more like a movie within a movie, or, that is to say, it feels more like a movie idea of what a movie should be. End quote. It was directed by a man called William Bodine, who had made a career of helming low-budget nonsense, including Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla in 1955, as well as directing more than 60 episodes of various TV Western series. Age 74 at the time of production, Bodine apparently had to rest between takes, his tiredness possibly exacerbated by the fact that he was shooting another horror western, Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, at the same time. Dracula was played by John Carradine, who certainly made more than his fair share of terrible movies, but even he had to admit that this one was possibly the worst, saying, quote, I have worked in a dozen of the greatest, and I have worked in a dozen of the worst. I only regret Billy the Kid vs. Dracula. Otherwise, I regret nothing. End quote. Released as a double bill with Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, it's fair to say that neither film lit a fire under the Western horror hybrid. A far more interesting entry would come along in 1971 with an ABC TV movie of the week called Black Noon. And another spoiler warning here, as I'm just about to tell you the ending. This features actor Roy Thinnes, perhaps best known as the protagonist of the cult sci-fi TV show The Invaders. Here he plays a travelling minister who, along with his wife, becomes stranded in the town of San Melas, where the townsfolk are having trouble with a local bad man called Noon. Seemingly welcomed as a saviour, things start to take a far darker turn, and, huge spoiler, it eventually emerges that the townspeople are up to no good. In a story that predates the Wicker Man by a good few years, it turns out that the villagers have deliberately trapped the preacher in the town, as they need to find somebody pure for their latest sacrifice. The story ends with our protagonist being hung upside down from his feet inside his newly built church, and then burned to death as the church is set on fire. Taking elements of The Devil's Mistress, in 1973 the film Hex was released, a Western supernatural horror that incorporated elements of the biker movie popularised by 1969's Easy Rider. Starring Keith Carradine, Gary Busey, Scott Glenn, and Christina Rains, this film follows a group of bikers who invade a Nebraska farm inhabited by a pair of Native American sisters. Once again, there is sexual assault followed by supernatural vengeance, and although writer Norman Mailer considered it to be one of his top 10 films of the year, it didn't gain much traction and disappeared for years. Again, it's available to watch on YouTube, but I have to admit, in my opinion, it's not that great. The acting is rather dubious, even from Carradine, and the pacing is rather slow. But once again, there are some interesting elements that make the storyline, at least, stand out from the pack. By this time, the Western boom had faded, caused by a saturation of the market and shifting audience tastes. Although it had received a last-minute shot in the arm through the success of 1969's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the emergence of the spaghetti western, as the 70s continued, the traditional Western myth had begun to feel outdated, particularly when set against the turbulence of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. By the time of the release of Blazing Saddles in 1974, the Western was tired, cliched, and almost beyond spoofing. In 1980, Michael Cimino released his Western drama Heaven's Gate, a film that is widely regarded as one of the most significant financial failures in Hollywood history. Grossing only $3.5 million in the US against a budget of $44 million, it effectively ended the reign of the new Hollywood directors, led to the sale of United Artists, and also drove another nail into the Western genre's coffin. The mid to late 80s did see some throwbacks to the Western, including 1985's Silverado, starring Kevin Costner, Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider, also in 1985, and the Brat Pack Western Young Guns, released in 1988. And alongside these, the decade also saw the release of folk horror western Eyes of Fire in 1983, and the modern-day vampire western Near Dark in 1987. This was co-written and directed by Catherine Bigelow in her solo directorial debut, and is one that we'll be talking about later in the series, so I'm going to move swiftly on. 1989 saw the release of the horror comedy western Sundown, the Vampire in Retreat, starring David Carradine, M. Emmett Walsh, and everyone's favourite Bruce Campbell. This features a colony of vampires looking for a peaceful life facilitated by ample applications of sunblock and a supply of artificial blood that's manufactured in the local factory. It's a fun but incredibly goofy movie with stop-motion vampire bats and some incredibly obvious stick-on beards. It's far from perfect, but if you like broad 1980s humour, you can find it available to watch in full on YouTube. In the following decade, the Western saw a fairly major Hollywood revival, triggered by Kevin Costner's 1990 movie Dances with Wolves, which won 7 Oscars. Naturally, this was enough to light the blue touch paper, and a series of Westerns soon followed, including Unforgiven in 1992, Tombstone in 1993, Wyatt Earp in 1994, and The Quick and the Dead in 1995. Naturally, this resurgence also led to a re-emergence of the Western horror hybrid, with, it has to be said, far more satisfying results than some of the films we've mentioned so far. 1990 saw the release of the anthology film Grim Prairie Tales, starring James Earl Jones and Brad Dourif, but perhaps more importantly, it also saw the release of Tremors, a modern-day Western monster movie set in the isolated town of Perfection, Nevada, starring Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward. In 1998, John Carpenter released Vampires, another modern-day Western vampire movie starring James Woods and Daniel Baldwin. And a year later, Antonia Bird released her movie Ravenous, a film we've mentioned more than a few times now, which stars Guy Pearce, Robert Carlyle, and David Arquette. By the early 2000s, Western horror had become more popular, and in 2004, the film Dead Birds was released. This follows a group of Confederate soldiers who rob a bank and then discover that their hideout is already occupied by the supernatural. Admittedly, some of the CGI is rather poor, but you can't fault its Gothic atmosphere and also the performances from stars Henry Thomas, Isaiah Washington and Michael Shannon. Ginger Snaps Back, also released in 2004, takes the popular werewolf franchise into the past, setting its story of lycanthropy at the 19th century Canadian frontier. 2008 saw the release of the very dark monster movie The Burrowers, which follows a rescue party in 19th century Dakota who find themselves coming up against the beasts of the title, with some incredibly bleak results. It is admittedly a rather flawed film, but it's one that I enjoy very much. It's a movie that isn't afraid to dive deep into the dark heart of the American West, asking the audience whether some of the humans are just as bad as the titular monsters. A film that is structurally very similar to The Burrowers is 2015's Bone Tomahawk, starring Kurt Russell, Patrick Wilson and David Arquette. Much as in the earlier film, here a group of settlers are captured and carried away, though this time not by subterranean monsters, but instead by cave-dwelling troglodytes. Following the abduction, a rescue party is sent out to find them, leading to some unbelievably brutal results. Praised for its combination of Western, horror and cannibalism themes, it is extremely well directed and acted and received positive reviews. It has to be said, though, that at the same time some did criticise its extreme moments of violence and also what were perceived as racist undertones. Writing in the New York Times, critic Jeanette Katsoulis did give the film a generally positive write-up, but also went on to say that it boasted appalling racial politics, concluding that, quote, "Of all the things we can expect from an Old West picture, cultural enlightenment isn't one of them," end quote. Happily, the same cannot be said for our first film of the week, which is The Wind from 2018. This was directed by Emma Tammi, written by Teresa Sutherland, and stars Caitlin Gerard, Ashley Zukerman, Julia Goldani-Tellez, and Miles Anderson. And it's now that time in the episode where we get into the spoilers, so please note moving forward, all my usual warnings apply. Set in New Mexico in the 19th century, The Wind is a non-linear film that tells its story across 3 multiple timelines. As the film opens, in the timeline that I'm going to refer to as the present, we meet 3 of our protagonists, Lizzie Macklin, her husband Isaac, and their neighbour Gideon. Gideon's young pregnant wife, Emma, has died, presumably by suicide, and Lizzie has been attempting to save Emma's unborn child through a caesarean section. Sadly, the procedure fails, and both Emma and her baby are buried in the wilderness. Following the burial, Isaac and Gideon ride off to the nearest town, leaving Lizzie alone in the cabin, at which point she is beset upon first by ravening wolves, and then by what we presume to be a demonic entity. Our second timeline goes back nearly a year and charts the arrival of Gideon and Emma in the region. As this narrative progresses, we gradually notice increasing tensions between Lizzie and Emma, caused mainly through sexual jealousy, but also through Emma's insistence that the land they are on is somehow bad. From this point on, Emma descends into madness as she becomes convinced that the land on which they have settled is haunted by a malevolent entity, a demon of the prairie, of which she has been warned through a pamphlet of the same name. The characters in the film are attempting to benefit from the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed citizens and immigrants to claim 160 acres of public land free of charge, provided they improved it and lived on it for 5 years. Claimants were required to build a house, cultivate a portion of the land, and also pay a small fee. And this opportunity drew people into the American heartland in the hopes of becoming landowners. But, as we all know, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and if the work didn't kill people, then it's possible that the isolation did. The theme of isolation lies at the heart of the movie, and it's an idea that is set up very early. We first see it through Lizzie's obvious excitement when Isaac tells her that they have new neighbours, and she wonders aloud what they might be like. Later, this is spelled out even more clearly, as Emma and Lizzie wash up after dinner. After Emma reveals, rather worryingly as it turns out, that she met a preacher on her journey to the region. She asks if there is a church nearby. Lizzie replies that there aren't enough people, and when Emma then asks how many there are, Lizzie's reply is, "Now? 4. This exchange is just one example of the lean and sparse nature of the screenplay, with characters revealing much while saying very little. At times it plays almost like a silent movie, and what exposition there is shown rather than told, slowly revealed as the story unravels across its shifting timelines. The screenplay was the debut feature written by Teresa Sutherland, who would later go on to work as a staff writer on the Mike Flanagan series Midnight Mass, before helming her own folk horror movie, Lovely, Dark and Deep, which was released in 2023. Sutherland grew up in Missouri and for many years lived in Kansas, where her family would frequently go on camping trips. These instilled in her both a love of nature and also, importantly, an appreciation of its darker elements, and these are themes that we can certainly see in her subsequent film work. As she grew up, she developed a love for the performing arts and initially studied to be a theatre director before gradually transitioning into film work. At this point, she began to gravitate towards horror, thinking it a natural fit for her growing thematic interests of fear and psychological tension. Before she left Kansas for university in Florida, she became part of a community garden, and it was here that she first heard the stories that would come to inspire The Wind. One day, gardening on the windy plains of Kansas, one of the older women told her that the wind used to drive women crazy, and intrigued, she asked to know more. 5 years later, when she entered film school at Florida State University, she realized that this was the story she wanted to tell for her thesis, and so started an extensive period of research. What her gardening partner had alluded to was a condition that has become known as prairie madness or prairie fever, and this is an umbrella term used to describe formerly stable people becoming depressed, anxious, irritable, and violent after moving to the Great Plains. This phenomenon was documented in a September 1893 issue of The Atlantic, in which journalist Eugene Smalley noted an alarming amount of insanity occurring in the new prairie states among farmers and their wives. He went on to suggest that one of the causes could be the extreme isolation, highlighting that for many settlers, especially those of European origin, the loneliness of frontier life was a very sharp contrast to their former existence. Quote, "The European farmer lives in a village where considerable social enjoyment is possible. The women gossip at the village well and visit frequently at one another's houses. The children find playmates close at hand. There was a school, and, if the village being not a very small one, also a church. The post wagon, with its uniformed postilion merrily blowing his horn, rattles through the street every day, making an event that draws people to doors and windows. The old men gather of summer evenings to smoke their pipes and talk of the crops, and the young men pitch quoits and play ball on the village green." Now contrast this with the life of a poor settler on a homestead claim. Every homesteader must live upon his claim for 5 years to perfect his title and get his patent. Many settlers own 320 acres, and a few have a square mile of land, 640 acres. The average space separating the farmsteads is, in fact, always more than half a mile, and many settlers must go at least a mile or two to reach a neighbour's house. End quote. The article concludes that a solution would be to abandon the isolated farmhouse and draw people together in villages, building communities and providing social interaction. But this, of course, is a suggestion that was never really taken up. The isolation was compounded by the harsh weather, characterized by short hot summers followed by long cold winters filled with blizzards. Once winter came, families would be stuck in their houses under several feet of snow, cramped inside for days at a time. But in addition to the snow and the often torrential rain, there was another distressing environmental factor. With flat land stretching out for miles and miles as far as the eye could see, The wind that swept across the prairie was loud, forceful, and rather alien compared to what settlers had experienced in their former lives. And so for many, it would seem, it was the sound of the wind, constant and ever-changing, that caused them to lose their minds. And recent studies have supported this, suggesting that the sounds of the prairie itself exacerbated the mental strain experienced by those who moved there and set up their homesteads. An anthropologist called Alex Velez has written that the space of the prairie, with its lack of the white noise that is generated by even small communities, only served to amplify what other sounds there actually were. In this case, the elements, and most notably, the wind. The way that I can describe it, he said, is that it's very quiet until suddenly the noise that you do hear, you can't hear anything but that. And this is certainly true for Emma in the movie, who says that the rain makes her restless and that she can hear the wind whispering to her, leading her to conclude, quote, "This place is wrong, we're not supposed to be here," end quote. Another scientist, Adrian K. Lee, has compared this effect to being in an anechoic chamber, which is sometimes known as the world's quietest space. Designed to completely absorb reflections of sound, these spaces are generally used for ultra-quiet acoustic testing, but they are also often used for a challenge, all in the name of scientific research, of course. This is known as the anechoic challenge, which involves people trying to stay inside a chamber for as long as possible. The goal is to stay for an hour, but so far the average duration has been 45 minutes. Participants have reported hearing their lungs filling, their blood flow, their heartbeat, and even the creaking of their own bones. The experience also leads to disorientation and hallucinations, and the lack of sound reflection can also cause a severe loss of balance. It would seem then that there is such a thing as too much peace and quiet. But whether it was the isolation, the back-breaking work, or the sound of the wind, the effects of prairie fever were all too real, with multiple reports of people becoming withdrawn, paranoid, and violently unstable. Men committed sudden acts of violence, and women were said to have lost all reason after months of isolation. Sadly, women seem to be the most susceptible to this condition, although there is a very practical reason for this, as opposed to any gender disposition. While the men would travel into town for provisions, the women would be left at home alone with their thoughts, often for weeks at a time. And so it's little wonder, given the isolation, harsh conditions, and the amplified sound of the wind, that many were left disturbed. Homesteader journals from the period are full of entries about the endless horizon driving them mad and the wind that never stops, while territorial papers frequently printed reports of people going insane from prairie life or suffering mental derangement from isolation. To give you an idea of the scale, in the 1880 census, the state of Nebraska, which had a population of 452,000, recorded 450 people as insane, and roughly half of these were women. Director Emma Tammi elaborated on this in an interview at the time of the film's release, saying that in her research she read multiple journals depicting the brutalities of prairie life. Quote, "The terrors of the land that were just blowing in on sometimes a daily basis were incredible. It was fascinating to read those accounts because visually it painted a picture of what the landscape was like at the time, and it was harsh and inhospitable. This was an area that people should not have been trying to live in. Everything was telling them to get out." End quote. And this, of course, is very true for Lizzie, who in the main timeline is left alone while Isaac and Gideon travel to town. It is here that she is attacked by wolves, and also possibly plagued by a demonic goat. But in the third timeline, we also see that similar events have happened before. This timeline goes back further still, detailing Lizzie and Isaac's arrival in the area, and Lizzie's own battles with a supposed demonic entity, which terrorizes her in her homestead whilst Isaac is away. The role of Lizzie is played quite brilliantly, in my opinion, by Gerard, an American actress and filmmaker who made her feature debut in David Fincher's 2010 movie, The Social Network. Her performance in the film is one I would describe as blistering, alternating between strength, kindness, terror, hysteria, and insanity as the different timelines run their course. And this is all the more impressive given that for large chunks of the film she is mostly silent and must demonstrate Lizzie's journey through sheer physicality alone. She was also very much drawn to the character of Lizzie, saying it is incredibly rare to have a character go through such an immense evolution while essentially being in a completely isolated state. She was also very drawn to the fact that in a genre typically dominated by men, the focus of this film was on the female experience. This is something that was also noted by actor Ashley Zukerman, who plays Gideon, who found it fascinating that in all the westerns he had watched, the story would follow the men when they left, whereas this film stayed with the women on the homestead. And this, of course, is amplified very much by the fact that the film was both written and directed by women. Once Sutherland had completed her research, she scripted and directed a short film titled The Winter, which was completed in 2012. Very much a template for her debut feature, this 15-minute movie tells of a frontier woman whose husband is dragged off into the darkness by something and who must survive both the evil presence outside and the harsh elements of 19th century Kansas. This short caught the attention of a man called Christopher Allender, who was impressed by her vision and asked her to develop it into a feature. At the time, Allender was setting up a film fund through his production company, Soapbox Films, with the idea of producing 3 independent movies. He decided very early on that he wanted Sutherland's script to be the first of the trio, and with funding in place, set out to find a director. He had already worked with Tammi on a documentary, and immediately knew that she would be perfect for the project. Tammi has described this as being a bit of a fairy tale in terms of how it came together, particularly given that by the time she came on board, they already had a script and the financing was already secured. Although, it has to be said, there was still some hesitancy on her part, saying that when Allender said the screenplay could use a female director, she inwardly rolled her eyes. Quote, "I thought I don't want to be brought onto this just because I'm a female. And just because it's a female lead, that doesn't mean a man can't crack it just as well. But then I read the script, and it's not that a man couldn't have directed it really well, but there was something I felt tapped into with the lead character. I don't know if I would tap into this the same way if I wasn't a woman. I kind of got it in that moment. I think it was really smart of Chris as a producer to say, I think there's something that a female director could bring to the story that would be different than a male." End quote. On meeting with writer Alexander, the two hit it off immediately and made a number of revisions of the screenplay to combine their artistic vision. Tammi was particularly struck by what she called the drama of the characters and the inner demons that Lizzie is battling across the narrative, the grief of losing a child, the isolation of frontier life, and the suspicion that not only are Emma and Isaac possibly having an affair, but that Emma is carrying Isaac's baby. It is these inner demons that eventually manifest in both her delusions and her behaviour, ultimately becoming a force far more frightening than the supernatural terrors she imagines, and which act as a metaphor for her internal conflict. During their discussions, Tammi and Alexander decided that Lizzie should be of German origin, reflecting the fact that, at the time, German-speaking immigrants were the second largest group of settlers in the United States. And fortunately, after casting Gerard, they discovered that she could actually speak fluent German, and this is something she demonstrates several times in the movie. The German backstory also makes Lizzie more of an outsider, feeding into the threat presented by Emma when she arrives on the prairie. It also underpins some of the conflict with Isaac, who blames her beliefs on some of the folklore of her home country. But there is, however, a far more pernicious influence than Lizzie's childhood, and this is a religious tract titled Demons of the Prairies. This tract, based on actual 18th century pamphlets, lists the various demons that exist on the land, a list recited out ritualistically when Emma is tied up in bed following her initial breakdown. Those listed include Balban, the invader of the weak mind, Jezebeth, the seductress, Sakorbanoth, the bringer of jealous thoughts, Agramon, the invoker of fear, Vetis, the shapeshifter, and Babel, the keeper of graves. This list also serves as an extension of both the narrative and Lizzie's mental state, with jealous thoughts infecting her mind concerning Emma, who she views, probably quite rightly, as a seductress. And in this context, it is Lizzie, and not a demon, who is the actual shapeshifter, as she is driven mad by the prairies, and her personality and behaviour morph throughout the film. Lizzie's fractured mental state is depicted both explicitly and metaphorically, especially through the use of her reflection. When washing blood from her hands before the mirror, her blurred image in the glass suggests that she has already lost herself, and later, in the mirror in the bedroom, she also appears as a fragmented character with a double reflection. Although we first see the pamphlet among Emma's belongings, through the earlier timelines we establish that the very same pamphlet also once preoccupied Lizzie, and was in fact given to her by a wayside preacher on her arrival in the territory. The preacher is played by Miles Anderson, a British actor who delivers one of the film's most memorable set pieces, transforming into a demon when he visits Lizzie late at night at the homestead. He is one of a fairly long line of malevolent movie preachers, stretching back to Robert Mitchum in Night of the Hunter, through to the unnamed preacher in Messiah of Evil, Reverend Cain in Poltergeist 2, and also the preacher in our second movie this week, The Dark and the Wicked. In horror, much as in life, the devil often appears as a wolf in sheep's clothing, leading the vulnerable to damnation while promising the exact opposite. Emma, who is a walking red flag, is played by Julia Goldani Tellez and is Lizzie's exact opposite. Petite, ultra-feminine, dark-haired, and also apparently there very much against her will. Within the first few minutes of her appearance on screen, a moment of tension between she and Gideon reveals that there are already problems in the marriage, and also that Gideon has moved them out there at exactly the wrong time of year. Coming from the city, she is clearly appalled by this situation in which she finds herself, pining for things of beauty as she admires the furniture in Lizzie's home, and also flirting quite openly with Isaac. She also acts as a mirror for Lizzie's own unspoken fears, that the land itself is bad in some way, and that moving out there might have been a mistake. Later, Emma reveals to Lizzie that she has seen things in the night, and also heard things whispering too. She goes on to ask whether Lizzie can remember how many graves she passed on the way there, causing the other woman to admonish her to not be unpleasant in front of the men. It's not surprising then that Lizzie begins to complain, not about the isolation, but about the lack of it, telling Isaac that at least in the city, strangers remain strangers, before adding that they no longer have that luxury. Although Sutherland's original screenplay was set in Kansas, during pre-production the team decided to film in New Mexico, choosing the region because of the quality of light and the way that the landscape embodied the iconography of Western cinema. This iconography is amplified by cinematographer Lynn Moncrief, who deliberately uses wide-angle shots to echo Western classics like the 1956 John Ford movie The Searchers, which both he and Tammi have cited as a reference. His composition also emphasises how insignificant the characters are against the landscape, surrounded by open spaces that stretch on for miles and on which it would be certainly easy to disappear. But we cannot mention a film called The Wind without talking about the sound design of the wind itself, which here acts as an additional character and also reflects Lizzie's increasing inner turmoil. The multi-textured effect of the sound design was made up of multiple wind recordings, with Tammi saying that they listened to every type of wind that's ever been recorded, as well as making their own. She would later say that she hadn't realised there was so much variety in the sound of the wind until she started working on this movie. And this sound design is complemented by an excellent score from Ben Lovett, who was asked to represent the wind itself through his soundtrack, something that he found an intriguing challenge because, he says, we don't actually hear the wind around us, we hear other things affected by the wind. The key musical motif was created with a nickel harper, a traditional 14th century fiddle from Sweden that he felt invoked the feel of the period. He also used bass flutes, wind chimes, and something that he called a handmade folk doorbell that he bought in the mountains of North Carolina, which produced a persistent decaying sound that he found incredibly unnerving. The film premiered in 2018 in the Midnight Madness slot at the Toronto International Film Festival, and then it continued on the festival circuit, including Fright Fest in London in August, which is when I first saw it. Following its tour of the festivals, it then received a theatrical and digital release from IFC Midnight, where it received generally favourable reviews. The UK Film Review called it an absorbing little nightmare, the LA Times called it terrifying, and the appropriately named David Fear from Rolling Stone suggested it was reminiscent of Roman Polanski's Repulsion if that film had been directed by John Ford. The comparison with Polanski's Repulsion is pretty close to the mark, and I'd also suggest there are certain parallels with Robert Eggers' The Witch, a film that I could quite easily have paired this with, and not just because of the inclusion of supernatural goats. A slow burn and subtle film, until its final moments at least, it isn't going to be for everyone. But as a narrative about the horrors of isolation and the demons that creep into our heads at our quietest and loneliest moments, it is compelling viewing, underpinned by incredibly strong performances by the two female leads. But while The Wind certainly isn't for those who like things more upfront, direct and in your face, strangely enough, this was exactly what Tammi would deliver in her follow-up movie. After receiving much praise for her feature debut, in 2022 she was approached by producer Jason Blum to direct the film adaptation of the video game series Five Nights at Freddy's. Premiering in 2023, it grossed just under $300 million at the box office, making it one of the highest-grossing films ever directed by a woman, and was Blumhouse's biggest ever opening weekend. Although it received mixed to negative reviews, its success quite naturally led to a sequel, also directed by Tammi, titled Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Despite receiving a generally negative response from critics and audiences, this again was a commercial success, grossing $240 million worldwide against a budget of approximately $51 million. According to IMDb, Tammi is currently working on the inevitable threequel, Five Nights at Freddy's 3, which is due for release in 2027. Teresa Alexander was widely praised for her screenplay and moved on first to work as a staff writer for Mike Flanagan and then to write and direct her debut feature, Lovely, Dark and Deep, which was released in 2023. Caitlin Gerard would continue with horror with an appearance in Insidious: The Last Key, which was also released in 2018. In 2019, she co-wrote, produced and directed a short film titled I Lost My Mother's Ashes. Now going by her married name of Kit Goldsmith, according to IMDb, she is currently in post-production on 2 more short films. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is The Dark and the Wicked from 2020. This stars Marin Ireland, Michael Abbott Jr., Lynn Andrews and Xander Berkeley, and was directed by Bryan Bertino. We've talked about Bryan Bertino a few times now, most recently when we discussed his role as a producer on The Blackcoat's Daughter, as well as initially back in episode 15 when we discussed home invasion movies and his 2008 debut, The Strangers. Since that debut, he has directed a further 4 movies, with The Dark and the Wicked marking his 4th feature as director. He was born in 1977 and grew up in North Texas, just south of Fort Worth, and gravitated towards movies at an early age. After graduating from high school in 1996, he enrolled at the University of Texas in Austin, where he studied cinematography and film production. Unlike many of his classmates, he had already developed a love of horror movies, and he said it was an experience at film school that initially gave him the idea he could combine horror with human drama, something that we see in many of his movies. Quote, I remember I had a weekend where we were watching movies in class, and everybody was bringing in a movie that other people hadn't seen. I brought in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because everybody dogged on horrors, because we were all watching Terrence Malick films and Godard and whatever. But I was like, I want to bring this back. Everybody watched it, and by the end of the movie, there was the silence that fills the room when you're just emotionally exhausted. Leatherface is waving his chainsaw in that beautifully shot moment with the sun, and it cuts to black, and everyone was silent. Then the next night we watched A Woman Under the Influence, the John Cassavetes film, and it was the same silence at the end of that. I realised that horror and drama can produce the same emotional exhaustion, and I was like, I think there's a way to tell character-driven horror films, where you could cry and scream and feel something, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. End quote. After film school, he moved to Los Angeles, where he initially worked on lighting design, developing a skill set that we can certainly see in action in all of his films. This also brought him into the orbit of Jerry Bruckheimer, with whom he worked for 2 years. During this time, Bertino has said he got on-the-job training in storytelling and also, crucially, how to fight for what you believe in. By this time, he had begun writing screenplays and initially submitted the screenplay for The Strangers for a Nicholl Fellowship grant in 2004. Reaching the quarterfinals, Bertino's screenplay, the fourth he had ever written, caught the attention of producer Roy Lee from Vertigo Entertainment, who would go on to become one of the primary production companies behind the film. In the same year, Bertino sold the screenplay to Universal, and various directors were attached to the project. These included director Justin Lin from the Fast and the Furious franchise, and then Mark Romanek, the director of 1 Hour Photo, among others. However, when both pulled out, Bertino was asked to direct it himself, a decision that was made after a meeting with Rogue Pictures, another of the production companies behind the film. For Bertino, who says up to this point he had never thought about directing, the decision came as something of a surprise, saying, quote, I was driving home and my agent called and they said they want you to direct. I told them that I didn't know how to do a lot, but I know what the story is, and if all you guys can gather around me and we can talk story, we can make up for the limitations that I have. I still had to buy books on directing, and I practiced saying action in the car the very first day. It's a really big deal. There are a lot of people looking to you. But you do get past those kind of fears. And it's really touching when you see all those people working together on an idea that you wrote down on a piece of paper. End quote. As we all know, The Strangers is a home invasion movie, and it was inspired in part by Bertino's childhood in rural Texas, a place where, he recalls, you could call out in the middle of the night and no one would hear you. And we can certainly see the influence of this upbringing in The Dark and the Wicked, not least because the farm in the movie is actually Bertino's own childhood home. The Strangers would become the sleeper hit of 2008, going on to spawn a direct sequel with 2018's The Strangers Prey at Night, and a less than critically acclaimed reboot with The Strangers Trilogy, which began in 2024. Bertino followed The Strangers with his 2014 movie Mockingbird, on which he acted as writer, director and producer. This is a found footage horror that I have to admit I hadn't watched until this week, when I finally did as research for this episode. As I mentioned last week, found footage isn't necessarily my favourite subgenre, and I could probably count on one hand the number of found footage movies that I genuinely love, and unfortunately Mockingbird is not one that I can add to the list. Personally, I found it too similar to The Strangers, while simultaneously not really being enough like The Strangers, and I have to admit I was also irritated by the ending. But that being said, Bertino certainly brings forth naturalistic and impressive performances from all of his cast, and there are some very effective moments, especially a sequence lit entirely by lightning. Although it was favourably reviewed by both Bloody Disgusting and IndieWire, since its release it has had quite the mixed reception, but it does develop the theme that seems to underpin most of his movies, that sometimes very bad things happen to good people, often randomly and inexplicably. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, at the same time he began working as a producer on The Black Coat's Daughter, whilst writing and developing his third movie, The Monster, which would be released in 2016. Possibly due to mismarketing, this also received a mixed reception, with audiences who were expecting a movie filled with monster fighting action rather perturbed by the intercutting flashbacks documenting the relationship between the central characters of mother and daughter. I have to say I quite like the film, not least because the monster of the title is both literal and metaphorical, referring to the mother's drinking, which has caused crevices, as opposed to fractures, in her relationship with her daughter. Driving her daughter to her ex-husband's, where she has now chosen to live full-time, they accidentally hit something in the road, and their car is a write-off as a result. Injured and stuck in the middle of nowhere, the two find themselves trapped in their car by something in the woods, and must now rely on each other for their survival. As mentioned, the narrative is intermingled with family drama, detailing the fractured relationship between the two that ultimately led them to this situation, and showing that beneath the surface hostility, there is real and genuine love. Once again, Bertino shows his ability to build suspense by suggestion, using camera work and lighting to hint at the horrors waiting in the shadows. And whilst it would be an exaggeration, not to mention blasphemy, to call him the Val Lewton of the 21st century, you can certainly see parallels that run through both of their works. In this case, this includes not just the use of suggestion, but also the use of horror as a package to deliver the actual story that he wanted to tell. He also facilitated terrific performances from both Zoe Kazan and Ella Ballantine as the protagonists, and wrung out a fair amount of tension, not to mention empathy and emotion, from the central premise. The LA Times was just one of the favourable reviews, writing that, quote, "Even when the monster is trying to scare you witless, every scene instantly reaffirms its character's humanity." End quote. In 2017, he served as executive producer on a movie called Stephanie, and then in 2018, he served as executive producer and co-writer on The Strangers Prey at Night. In the same year, he also executive produced a horror movie called Hurt, about a couple having a particularly unpleasant Halloween. At the same time, as if he wasn't busy enough, he began working on pre-production for our second movie of the week, The Dark and the Wicked, which would be released in 2020. And now we are going into the spoiler section of the episode, so if you haven't seen the movie, please drive carefully from here on in. Of Bertino's movies, I personally find this one to be the most satisfying, though there are those who still prefer the more straightforward narrative of his feature debut. That being said, at the time of its release, it was very well received by both critics and fans alike, with some calling it the scariest horror film that they had ever seen. Whilst I have to say I don't necessarily agree with this level of hyperbole, I certainly think that the film is a masterclass in creeping dread, and on its release it was compared favourably with films like Don't Look Now, The Tenant and Alien in Bertino's ability to build tension and atmosphere. Shot at Bertino's childhood home, The Dark and the Wicked builds on his trademark theme of terrible and inexplicable things happening to good people, whilst also delivering a character-driven story about family relationships and generational guilt. The narrative tells the story of a family in rural Texas who are being tormented and terrorized by a nameless demonic entity that appears to have targeted them for no other reason than that they were there. The parental figures are listed in the credits simply as mother and father, reducing them to archetypes that allow Bertino to play with the real-life fears that plague many people as they move through their 30s and beyond. What will I do when the inevitable happens and the health of my parents begins to fail? Will I be strong enough to support them? And what will happen to my everyday life as a result? Speaking as somebody who grew up with much older parents, it's a concern that can strike you in the oddest of moments, and is generally triggered by the first time you realise your parents are both ageing and vulnerable. In a similar fashion to the very different but excellent Australian horror Relic, which was released in the same year, the supernatural elements in this film are as much a metaphor for the impact of parental decline and the associated generational guilt as they are actually supernatural. And if you've never seen Relic, by the way, it is well worth a watch, and it's also a film we'll be discussing in a few weeks' time. The movie opens with a beautifully executed sequence featuring Mother, menaced by an unseen thing as she finishes up a sewing project in her workroom. Outside, but within an animal pen, a herd of goats are enclosed by strings bearing bottles, horseshoes, and other trinkets, which acts as a sonic alarm and also a mechanism to ward off evil. And this nod to folk magic clearly signposts that things have been wrong at the farm for a very long time. Mother checks her alarm system and then returns to the farmhouse where, after tending to her invalid husband, she is disturbed by a noise outside. She is certainly afraid of something, and it is soon revealed with very good reason. The alarm system around the goat pen is violently triggered by an unseen force, and soon after, when preparing a meal, a chair is mysteriously drawn up in the kitchen behind her. These opening moments, which are expertly composed by DP Tristan Nyby and lit by Jesse Curl, set up the style of the movie with long, silent and static shots and slow, creeping camera work, creating a building sense of dread. Filming in Bertino's parents' house also meant that all of the set and the set dressing was pretty much already in place, although some additional pieces were added by Bryan's stepmother. But for the most part, and according to producer Adrian Biddle, the house that we see on screen is the house that he writes in when he stays with his family. This only goes to show how personal the material is to him, something that was reinforced by Biddle in an interview in which she revealed it was very much the subtext of the story that drew her to the project. Quote, "It's a milestone in all of our lives. Whether it's the loss of a parent or having to take care of one, as we live longer, all of us are going to fade. That spectre is something we haven't seen talked about in this particular way before, and I was hopeful that people would be able to relate to that. I know that Bryan has experienced loss in that way, and I think he tapped into some of that when he was writing the script. Stephen King addresses that in a lot of his novels, the physical act of dying and death can be grotesque, and that sometimes it can be in your face, but you just have to deal with it." End quote. And the two characters who have to quote-unquote deal with it are our protagonist Louise and her brother Michael. Louise is introduced immediately after the opening titles, returning to her parents' farm to support her mother, who is caring for her father, who is bedridden, catatonic, and on the verge of death. Louise is played by Marin, who we last saw a few weeks ago with her portrayal of Nora in The Empty Man. A different actress had originally been cast in the role, but had to drop out due to scheduling issues, and co-star Michael Abbott Jr., who had already been cast, suggested Ireland. And suggested might actually be an understatement. According to an interview with Dread Central, he really went to bat for Marin, saying that he called her personally and that he begged the producers and that he begged Bryan. A Tony Award-nominated actress, the New York Times once called her one of the great drama queens of the New York stage. She made her film debut in 2004's The Manchurian Candidate in a blink and you'll miss it role as an army transcriber. She went on to appear in numerous TV shows and films, including 2008's Rachel Getting Married, which starred Anne Hathaway, and 2014's Glass Chin, a crime drama for which she was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award. And despite now having appeared in 2 rather good horror movies, she has said she's not a big fan of horror, saying that she has a sensitive constitution. So, on receiving the script, she remembers thinking she would just flick through it, but she found it so personal and so terrifying it immediately caught her attention. Meeting with Bertino convinced her further, though even then she didn't fully appreciate how grueling and intense the film process would be. The grueling aspect of filming came from the requirement to film multiple setups, often filming 17 shots where a more conventional movie would have just done it in 3. She has called this an incredibly immersive experience that gave her a greater respect for the horror genre, though the need to conserve energy to film multiple shots of immensely intense moments was certainly something she found a challenge. Front and centre for much of the movie, Ireland gives a performance that evidences why she was nominated for a Tony. Returning home as much out of guilt and duty as anything else, the character of Louise is incredibly textured, demonstrating the complex array of emotions that pass through you in these kind of circumstances. She is tired, she is guilty, she is grief-stricken, she is stressed, and she is in shock, becoming increasingly anxious as the story progresses and the truth is gradually revealed. Ireland said that this gave her a lot to navigate, and had compared it to running a marathon. But throughout it, she said she felt protected by Bertino, who was, quote, right there with me in the room. He's not a director that is off watching the monitor 3 rooms over. He was usually right near me, trying to stay very, very connected to how I was doing and where I was. That really let me open up a great deal. End quote. And this vulnerability allows her to give an exceptionally good performance, not just in the moments of high terror, but also in the quieter sequences of the film, particularly a gently moving moment when she discovers in her mother's workroom the dress on which she had been working. Unwrapping the paper from the tailor's dummy, she reveals a beautiful white silk gown that is labelled simply Louise. As well as causing a lump in the throat for both the character and the audience, this scene also serves to demonstrate the woman her mother had been before the opening of the story, a contrast to the strained and stressed figure we meet in the opening scenes. It is not surprising then that Bertino manages to draw such strong performances in all of his films. He is clearly very much an actor's director, which is nicely combined with his talent for both an arresting image and building incredible tension. He and Ireland spent time developing Louise's backstory, considering who she had been and the life that she was leaving behind. Louise, they decided, was feeling unmoored and somewhat lost in life, creating a key difference between her and brother Michael, who, away from the film, has his own family life to consider. He is played by the coincidentally named Michael Abbott Jr., who, much like Ireland, says he was never much of a horror fan for no other reason than he says they scare the shit out of him. But on reading the script and knowing that Bertino was directing, he was immediately on board. As we've already heard, he was instrumental in the casting of Ireland as his sister, something that was inspired by the fact they had previously worked together playing siblings in a 2016 movie called The Radiant City. Although they had only been together in one scene in that movie, he said it had forced them to build a sibling relationship, and he felt that they could build on this for The Dark and the Wicked. And I have to say, in my opinion, he was right. The dynamic between the two does feel like a real brother-sister relationship, with all of its shared history and love, as well as its frustrations. Much like Ireland, Abbott Jr. gives a very good performance, playing a man torn by loyalties to both of his families. He is also responsible for one of the film's main jump scares when he is haunted by the spirit of his mother, or most likely the demonic entity masquerading as his mother. He has described the filming experience as being somewhat creepy, partly due to the real contents of the house and the set dressing, and also partly due to the isolated location, saying, quote, "We were out in the middle of nowhere in Texas. It's very dark. People say this movie is dark and that they have a hard time seeing, and I say try being there, because that's how it was." End quote. After meeting our two protagonists, we return to the farmhouse, where Mother is withdrawn and angry, saying that she told them not to come, a sentiment already expressed to Louise on her arrival. This, as we later discover, is not the usual bravado one might hear from an elderly parent, but more because she wanted to keep them away for their own protection, knowing that the entity will only start to pursue them too. At this point, these siblings discuss the deterioration of their parents, and we learn that Louise has been distant from the family for some time. This dialogue, of course, introduces the subtext of the film, with the pair expressing their guilt and wondering how best to take care of their mother. But meanwhile, Mother is chopping vegetables in the kitchen, leading to a moment that, whilst admittedly wince-inducing, has become something of a cliché. The accidental, or should that be deliberate, chopping through one's own fingers while cutting vegetables at a chopping board. Following this incident, Mother takes her own life by hanging herself in the barn, though, as we later come to find out, there is no physical way she could have ended up in the position that she does. The nurse tells them that before her death, their mother used to spend hours whispering to their comatose father, though from where she was watching, it looked like she was talking to someone else. Soon after, Louise and Michael find Mother's journal and come to realise she believed a demon was killing her husband, signing off her final entry with the words, "Devil, devil, devil, he wants David's soul." From here on in, the film follows these siblings' need to uncover the truth, with Michael initially sceptical, while Louise presents as the opposite. But Michael's doubts soon fall by the wayside when he is visited by a representation of his dead mother, both inside his bedroom and also in the film's most reproduced image, levitating at night outside his window. The farm help, Charlie, is driven to suicide by a demonic entity which takes Louise's form, and Michael and Louise are visited by the second of this week's sinister preachers. He is played with a perfect dark ambiguity by Xander Berkeley, who is also an accomplished makeup artist, painter and sculptor. He began his big screen career playing Christopher Crawford in the 1981 camp classic Mummy Dearest, and has since appeared in over 200 movies and TV shows, including Terminator 2, Kick-Ass, 24, The X-Files and Apollo 13. Horror fans, though, will recognise him from his role as the duplicitous villain Gregory in The Walking Dead, and from his performance as Helen Lyle's cheating husband in 1992's Candyman. He was cast in the film rather spontaneously and also at the very last moment, following a meeting with one of the producers at the South by Southwest Film Festival, a week before the preacher scene was due to be shot. He accepted the role as it played to a double archetype, portraying what he has called both the holy man and the unholiest of presences beneath the cloth. At one point, Berkeley has said, Bertino toyed with the idea that the preacher may be the devil himself, though his identity is one that is actually left unresolved. He does, however, offer the siblings insight as to the validity of their own non-belief system, asking them, quote, "What does it matter whether you believe? You think the wolf cares if you believe he's a wolf? Not if he finds you alone in the woods." End quote. He appears to return later that evening, standing in the darkness, accompanied, appropriately enough, by the howling of a wolf, ominously inviting them to come outside and mocking the death of their mother by offering them a rope. There is no explanation given for the entity's presence and no real clue as to why this family has been chosen, though considering Bertino's body of work, it's probably just because they happen to be there. The entity plays very much by its own rules, possibly taking physical form throughout the movie, or possibly just causing hallucinations and exerting mind control. In either case, the results are truly horrific. The film certainly has its fair share of unpleasant moments, as well as some nightmarish imagery, some of which works very well, and some of which, for me, doesn't really. The Jacob's Ladder-inspired animation of Father's face as Louise encounters him when she showers feels something of a cliché, and an unnecessary CGI spider in Father's bed also throws me out of the film just a little. For me, the best moments are the ones of mounting anxiety and creeping horror, like the visit of the preacher, and perhaps more so, the visit of the girl, who claims to be Charlie's granddaughter, but who is, in fact, anything but. As this moment shows, the entity doesn't just want to kill those who cross its path, it also delights in tormenting its victims, for no other reason than that it can. The most horrifying example of this is at the film's climax, where it induces Michael to take his own life by creating a hallucination of his dead family. Here Bertino delivers a double blow, creating shock in the viewer first with the suggestion that Michael's wife and children have all been slaughtered, and then with the realization that all was a hallucination, as his dead body is then discovered by his screaming wife. If anything, this double punch somewhat overshadows the actual climax of the film, where Louise, proving that no good deed goes unpunished, first witnesses her father's final breath and is then attacked by his reanimated corpse, now presumably housing the demonic spirit. It's an incredibly bleak ending, leaving no comfort at all for the viewer and underlining the film's themes of hopelessness, guilt, and the inevitability of death. Clearly a deeply heartfelt project, The Dark and the Wicked was originally scheduled to have its world premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival in April 2020. However, following the cancellation of that event due to the global pandemic, it eventually premiered at the Fantasia International Film Festival on August the 28th. But it was when it was released on Shudder in February of 2021 that it started to gain real attention. Coming in the middle of the pandemic, it spoke not only to the sense of isolation, but also to audience concerns about their own families. And of course it also gained a reputation for its slow build of tension, as well as its more obvious horrors. Though others may disagree, as I already mentioned, it remains my favourite of Bertino's output, though admittedly I still have yet to see the film that he directed next. This was Vicious, starring Dakota Fanning, which seems to once again explore his themes of metaphorical random acts of violence. When viewed altogether, his body of work suggests a rather dark view of society, and to date it is only The Monster which offers a more positive view of human nature. It is yet to be seen whether this will continue with his next feature, but his focus on character-driven horror is one that I am fully on board with, and so I will continue to watch his career with interest in the future. The Wind and The Dark and the Wicked are both slow burn horrors featuring demonic influence, in one case possibly imaginary, and in the other very real. Both showcase complex performances from their central protagonists, and use rural locations as settings for horror and madness. One may be a Western folk horror and the other a rural Southern Gothic, but together they showcase the horrors of isolation and warn of the tricks that your mind can play on you, whether induced by the environment or even by demonic forces. Very downbeat, if not somewhat depressing, they may not necessarily be films you would want to watch to have a happy time, but with their focus on characterization as much as on scares, they certainly reward lovers of slow burn horror with something far deeper than just creeping menace. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can always email thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow the Instagram account @thehorrordouble. Next week we are tackling the horrors of divorce, beginning with Possession from 1981. This stars Sam Neill, Isabella Gianni, and was directed by Andrzej Żuławski. Then we are following this with our third film in the series from director Alex de la Iglesia, with his film La Bruja de Zukerman, which was given the absolutely dreadful English language title of Witching and Bitching. This stars regular De La Iglesia collaborators Hugo Silva, Mario Casas, and Carmen Maura, and was released in 2013. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.